Have you ever done this balloon rocket activity? So it's just a balloon, a string with some tape. And the idea is that when I release this balloon, the air is going to be expelled to my right, and that's going to force the balloon to go to my left. So this is a really classic way to explain Newton's laws, action, reaction, thrust forces. I've seen some teachers do free body diagrams, which we'll get into. So let me just show you the quick version. So if I let go, you can kind of guess what will happen. That's it. And I have the string attached to the wall here, and then I'm just holding it on this end. Typically, if you look up the science balloon rocket activity, the idea is that a larger balloon will have more air, which will result in a greater thrust force, causing the balloon to travel faster down the string. If I were to release some of the air and compare it to a smaller balloon, this has less air inside, so less thrust force, so it'll go a little slower. Makes sense, right? That's actually not correct. Totally wrong. And we are actually promoting some misconceptions here, because when we draw the free body diagram, and I've had some teachers set this up and go through the whole challenge, and I'm like, wait, you're missing a really, really important element. And that's what we're going to talk about in this video. How to break down this activity in a way that promotes accurate science learning. But first, let me tell you who I am. So my name is Natasha Wilkerson. I am the co-founder of Vivify STEM. I have a degree in aerospace engineering. I have built and designed rockets. So rockets, balloon rockets, they're my thing. I know about it in the real world, and I'm here to help you connect those real world concepts into this classic science activity, but in a way that really promotes an accurate understanding of the forces on a rocket. Many state standards ask students to think about what those real forces are that are acting on a rocket. And when we do activities like this, we often leave out one really important force. So let's dive in. Okay, so to kick off this activity in your classroom, I recommend setting up this demo. A really fun way to do it is to have a very long piece of string, like 20, 30 feet, depending on the length of your classroom, and setting this up really high over their heads. So you can have it on either end of the classroom, and then you can release the balloon over the students, and they just love it. So one thing to focus on is we've talked about Newton's laws. So if I were to release the balloon, where is the air going? In what direction? It's going this way. So then what direction is the balloon going to go? It's going to go that way. So we have action and reaction. We can also talk about net forces. So before I release the balloon, what are the forces acting on the balloon? So there's nothing coming out of this end here. It's just sitting on the string. So we have the force of gravity pulling it down. And then we have this string, this normal force against gravity. So it's not moving anywhere. But there's nothing going in this direction. So our net force is zero. There's no acceleration. As it's moving down the track, what is happening? What are our forces? So let's draw it out. So I've got my beautiful drawing of a balloon. And we talked about the force of gravity going down. We talked about an equal and opposite force. You can call it the normal force, whatever you want to call it, counteracting that force of gravity. And that's really acting here. Then we have the direction of movement that way. So sometimes students get confused and add that as a force. That's just the direction we're going. The acceleration is moving that way. But the air is moving that way, right? But that's not the direction of the force. The direction of the force is actually propelling the balloon forward. And aerospace engineers typically call that thrust. So our thrust is pushing the balloon forward. And in this case, that's in the direction of motion. The air is going backwards, but that's not on this free body diagram. We are just concerned about the forces acting on the balloon. Now, this can get more complicated, right? So you could be thinking about the air moving in here, but we're just looking at this as the overall system. So typically, this is where we end with this free body diagram. And when I've done this with students, this is the forces that they tell me. Now, I want you to hook your students, amaze them, blow their mind with the next demonstration. So you are going to now have 2 strings. You are going to have 2 tracks, and you want them to be one on top of the other. And I'm going to show you here in a second. I did this demonstration with my family to give you a sense of what it could look like in your classroom. But the idea is you want a big, really, really big balloon, and then you want a smaller balloon. I recommend practicing this ahead of time just to make sure it works out the way you think. But when you do the big demo, you talk about that action reaction, the forces acting on the balloon, and then you say, okay, so now let's do an experiment. We have a large balloon and a small balloon. I am going to release them at the same time. Which balloon will reach the end of the string first? And the reaction, I'll let you think about it for a second. You can probably guess what the reaction is. So I'll pause here and I'm going to show you this video. I don't recommend doing this with a really long piece of string like that 20 foot across the classroom. Stick with around 6 to 10 feet because you want the smaller balloon to get to the end. But just watch what happens. You ready?
Ready? 1, 2.
So what you noticed is that the smaller balloon actually zoomed by the large balloon and had a much greater acceleration. It's kind of weird, right? Because I thought that a bigger balloon had more thrust, more force, more reaction force, so shouldn't it go faster? Well, you can think of this balloon as a tank of gas. The more air you have, the more gas in the car. But the balloon, the way that this air is coming out depends on the size of this nozzle. And there's some other differences. There's also material properties of the balloon and the elasticity. So the bigger the balloon is maybe stretchier, so it's going to push it a little bit faster out. But that just kind of gets really complicated. So I really just want to focus here on the size of the balloon is like a tank of gas. The bigger balloon is going to have more gas, but we're still going 60 miles an hour. We're just going to have more gas compared to the smaller balloon, less gas, less air, going the same rate of speed. You're just not going to go as long. So if you had that long piece of string, 20, 30 feet, that small balloon is going to run out of steam, run out of gas a lot quicker. But it's going to get faster to where that end of the string is. Now, the other piece to keep in mind, and if they're not convinced here, say they're like, no, I don't believe you. A great demo to do is to blow up 2 balloons of different sizes and then have students put their hands over it. So you can actually have them feel the force of the balloon pushing up on their hand. And if you have 2 students, so you have someone hold it like this and someone from underneath, and they let go at the same time, you can actually feel that it's the same force. You don't like have a much greater force from the bigger balloon. So that's kind of one way that they can explore it themselves, that the thrust force is about the same in both balloons. So something else is going on. And this is where we can introduce a new demonstration. All right, so an easy way to do this demonstration is with 2 sheets of paper. They're going to be exactly the same. One you're going to crumple up, and the other one you're going to leave flat. And you're going to ask your students, when I drop these pieces of paper from the exact same height, which sheet of paper will hit the ground first? Right? You can't see it, but that ball of paper went way faster. So this one travels so much faster than this. And it's because of another force called drag, air resistance. If you are in a car and you stick your hand out the window, and if you keep it flat, it kind of slides through, but once you move it like this, oh, there's that drag, there's that air resistance. We don't really teach this in science. We teach more idealized laws that don't think about this force of drag, but it's all around us every day. We need to know about it in airplanes and in cars and in football, sports that kids play. It's so important. And it's very intuitive actually to the kids, and they get confused when we ignore it. But for this balloon demo, we got to bring it back because the balloon is very sensitive to drag. You can repeat this demonstration with two balloons. Have a really large balloon and a small balloon. Which one is going to hit the ground first? The small balloon, because there is less surface area, so less drag forces that are pushing up against it. And that's what's going on in our balloon rocket demonstration. Okay, so our up and down forces were zero. Gravity is canceled out by this normal force that's acting here on the straw and the string. Then we have this thrust force, and now we have, this is drag or air resistance. It always moves in the opposite direction of motion. So if our balloon is moving that way, air resistance will always go that way. And it's these two forces that are fighting against each other. And that's how we're getting a change in speed. And so initially, you're going to have this thrust force, and a big balloon is going to have a lot of drag. As the balloon gets smaller, your drag force is actually going to decrease. And so you could do some interesting calculations here because this thrust force is about the same throughout the whole journey on the string, but this drag force actually does change. But the obvious piece is when you just compare two balloons of different sizes side by side, and you can visually see that one is much faster than the other. So now you hand it off to the students and you say, I want you to explore this relationship, the relationship between the size of the balloon and the time it takes to get to the end of the string. Because it's not as straightforward as you might think. And this is where you can introduce the term optimization. How can we optimize the size of the balloon to get to the end the fastest? Because it's not the biggest balloon. We just realized that. A really, really big balloon isn't going to go as fast because of drag pushing back on it. A really, really small balloon isn't going to have enough gas in its tank, enough air to get it to the end. So you kind of have to play around with those two. And then there's like this other weird material force from the elasticity. Up to you if you want to introduce that. You can also look that up. You can see the stress strain curve. It's like the forces acting on the balloon over time as the air is being pushed out. So that's a more advanced, if you're teaching, say, juniors and seniors in high school, that would be maybe something to look into. But just play around with this relationship and just trying to figure it out with some simple experiments. Have the students get in teams, give them each a 6-foot length of string, and here I'm going to tell you how to set it up next. Let's talk about setup. So the supplies are really simple. You just need a string, a balloon, some scissors, tape, and a straight straw. So don't get one of those flexi or bendable straws. You need a straight straw. Now, the hardest part about the setup is actually where to put the string. I recommend using chairs. So giving each team 2 chairs and then attaching the string to the back of each chair and making sure that the string is level. You can also use thumbtacks and attach it to the wall. So you could do one end to a wall, which I have right now, and then the other end to a string. I've also had students just hold it. So we set up a wall of balloon rocket runways, if you will. So one end is thumbtacked to the wall, and then the other end, the kids just hold it. So it's not as accurate, kind of keeping it level. So that would be another variable in this experiment that the kids can recognize. All right, so you have the string, and then the tricky part is threading the straw onto the string. So I'm just kind of pushing it through until it comes out of the other end. Here we go. So again, I'm going to do the version where I have one end attached to the wall. There's just a thumbtack over there, and then I'm going to hold this end. So it's just really easy to set it up. Setting that down, I have my balloon. Make sure to stretch it. And you need to blow it up first before you attach it to the straw. And with germs and COVID and all of that, have one kid in charge of blowing up the balloon. And if you're still wearing masks in your classroom, maybe having them blow it up in the hallway. So you'll need to think a little bit about the logistics there, because kids and saliva, that can get a little tricky. Okay, so for the purpose of this demo, I'm going to go about this big. Now, part of this activity is changing the size of the balloon and how that impacts how far it travels or how fast it travels on the string. I like to have kids figure out how to measure the size of their balloon. So if they have a measuring tape, they might try to stretch it around. If you give them a ruler, they'll kind of try to figure it out. The trick is to use the string. And so having the string, wrapping it around the balloon and using that as a way to measure the circumference. And so I can see here, that's my circumference of the balloon. And then it's easy for me to take that and to measure that than to try to wrap a measuring tape around the balloon. And this is where you can delegate roles. So someone on the team is blowing up the balloon. Someone might be holding the track, is in charge of kind of assembling it. Someone's a recorder during the experiment. This is a great way to assign those roles. Okay, so the other piece now, you want the balloon is gonna travel in the opposite direction of where the air is getting expelled. So we want the balloon to go that way. So that's why we're going to attach it like this. And you'll want to have the balloon and then you'll put the string. So let me do that here. The other piece and why you need two people to do this is it's a little tricky for me to get it lined up. So it's going to be a little bit lopsided for my demo, but that's okay. But when you have two people, you can have it centered really well on the balloon. And so all I did was I taped it. And then let's see what happens. All right, so that's the classic balloon rocket experiment. In the handout, I've included some questions to help your students go through this lab. Now, I don't like to be overly prescriptive. I don't want to say step 1, do this, step 2, do this. I give students the freedom to set up their experiment how they think makes sense. So I don't actually tell them how to measure the circumference of the balloon. I don't tell them what circumference to measure. I just tell them we want to explore this relationship of the size of the balloon and how long it takes to get to the end. How are we going to do that? How are we going to set it up? Should everybody do the exact same thing? Should everybody have the same length of string? And you can really get into some interesting discussions that give the students some opportunities for critical thinking, understanding of the nature of science. So how does the scientific process work in designing experiments? Because they don't always have lab books that tell them what to do for that experiment. And then in the end, what was kind of off? Did you get that time exactly right? Was having multiple trials important? And so on. After that is where we're going to have some fun. So you figure out this relationship, you're trying to optimize the size of the balloon, and then we're going to introduce the idea of a real rocket. And you can play a clip from a NASA rocket launch, SpaceX, there's so much cool stuff out there. And you're going to ask them, okay, what's different about that rocket and our rocket? And probably the first thing they're going to say is it's going in the wrong direction. Our balloon rocket is going horizontal, but a real rocket is going up. And you're like, yes. So let's think about what's happening. So let's turn our balloon rocket upwards. We now have the force of gravity going down. Our thrust is still going in the same direction. So we can put it like this. And where you put these arrows doesn't really matter as long as it makes sense to you and you can and it's understanding to the students. All right, so we have gravity going down, the thrust going up. If it's going up, the balloon's going up, that means drag is going down. I'm just going to put a D for drag. You can also talk about different types of drag. So there's the drag of the air. There's also the friction, another type of drag of the straw on the string. We'll assume that's negligible, but it's also going to be a constant in this experiment. But now this thrust has to overcome not only drag, but gravity. How can we optimize this setup, this size of balloon, to go up? And that's where you can have some fun. So what I do with my students is I set up a vertical balloon launch. And this now mimics much more closely the real forces of a rocket. And I had a hook on the ceiling and we tied a string, and then we had it tied to the floor on a piece or on a chair. And you could have a couple stations throughout the room. And the goal here is to, one, again, look at the relationship, but to optimize how fast you can get to the top. And you can be a competition here who can build the fastest rocket. You can also throw in another constraint of, well, we've learned about drag, surface area matters, but also streamlining it. So the end of the balloon is kind of flat. What if we added a nose cone, like a rocket? Do you think fins would make a difference? But adding those pieces adds weight, which is bringing down our rocket, gravity, right? So it's making it heavier. So you can play around with this and kind of let them experiment and explore. And that's what I just love about this hands-on approach to science, where the kids are really leading it. And they are like, they think they're in charge. You're there guiding the whole process. You have an end goal, but the kids are really in the driver's seat, taking charge of the experiment. And then there's such a great connection to those real rockets. So to end this session, I'm going to play you a clip of a NASA rocket just to get you inspired and excited for this activity. I hope you enjoy. Thank you.